Now, if all you know about the PlayStation 1 era survival horror games is what YouTube tells you, then you'll probably be sitting and thinking, why has anything changed? Because when you look at the discourse online, all you see for this era is love. What a lot of creators neglect to mention is that the tank controls, the traditional survival horror tropes, got old pretty fast. The original Resident Evil released in 1996, and by its third entry in 1999, you were already starting to see action elements and different control scheme gimmicks pumped into the gameplay. This was because a lot of people were losing interest with this style of game. Resident Evil 3 and Dino Crisis, the first one that is, are perfect examples of Capcom having to adjust to a changing audience and changing trends. And in this weird adjustment period, you start to see really cool things like ambitious camera angles, more ways of interacting and handling your weapons, set pieces, things that would start to become very commonplace on the PlayStation 2 and later on the PlayStation 3. This is kind of where we start to see that birthplace of it. But they still had a long way to go. Even entries that came out that same year in 1999, like Silent Hill, showcased that you could do something radically different, even more different than Resident Evil 3 and Dino Crisis, and still have the game function as a survival horror game. In Silent Hill, you don't have inventory management, ammo is pretty plentiful, and there isn't a, structure by structure, level by level approach to the game. Of course, you do have levels and you do have that puzzle-based structure, but you also have this wide open town that you can just wander around. The packages that these games could come into and what a survival horror game could be defined as was really changing at this point here. Then of course we can take a look at Resident Evil 4. Now Resident Evil 4 and the Resident Evil remake both came out around the same time. The Resident Evil remake was 2002 and Resident Evil 4 was 2005, and both of these games served as a testing ground to see how audiences would respond to the radically different gameplay formulas. On the one hand, you had a perfected version of traditional survival horror that still stands up to this day as a masterclass of that kind of game. And then you have Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 introduced us to the behind-the-shoulder camera, laser sight aiming, third-person shooting, quick-time events and action set pieces as a stand-in for that survival horror experience. And guess what? Resident Evil 4 won, because this traditional formula, even at its best, was considered outdated and overplayed at this point. That brings us to the first Dead Space. Now, Dead Space basically took Resident Evil 4 and made it control better. You could move and shoot. You had better control over the camera. Transitioning between different speeds, reloading, switching weapons. It was all so much better. It was nowhere near as menu heavy or clunky as Resident Evil 4. But it wasn't really until Dead Space 2 in 2011 that we had that lightning in a bottle moment. Now, Dead Space 2 is so far removed from survival horror that it makes even Resident Evil 4 look like a traditional survival horror game. You see, Dead Space 2, you can move and shoot, but it's to an extent that's so smooth that it literally went on to define basically how every third-person game would control. This would go way beyond just survival horror, which, trust me, there were a lot of copycats that tried to control exactly like Dead Space 2, and we'll talk about that more in a second, but even games like Resident Evil 6, Metal Gear Solid 5, Helldivers 2, all of these third-person games that have really nice movement and shooting within the third-person space kind of mimic how Dead Space 2 works. And while I don't want to say Dead Space 2 invented this kind of control set, I do want to say that this was the first AAA example of a game that controlled in the standardized way that we have become accustomed to, and that sets the standard for a game feeling good even to this day. So let's take the Resident Evil 4 remake for example. You can move and shoot. There's a lot of contextual action-y bits when it comes to the combat here. Of course, there's, building upon Dead Space with the parry system and the advanced melee system, which kind of puts Dead Space 2 to shame, but it's building off of the foundations showcased here in Dead Space 2. Even the Dead Space remake, how did they take one of the most beloved survival horror games of all time and make it better? They made it control like Dead Space 2. The movement in zero gravity is better, there's a lot more options in the combat with stuff that was innovated in 2011 with Dead Space 2. And both of these games, Resident Evil 4 Remake and the Dead Space Remake, showcase how Dead Space 2 really just hit that nail on the head with how a third-person shooter, whether it's horror or whether it's action, should control. So when I go back and I look at changes contextual things to blow up in Resident Evil 3, more ambitious camera angles toying with how this could look like, the over-the-shoulder laser sight aiming, I see it all building up to Dead Space 2, and I don't think there's been a game that has influenced not just its genre, but gaming controls as a whole in regards to third-person shooters as much as Dead Space 2 has. To have this kind of effect over 10 years later is something that needs to be recognized, and when I ask people about a lot of survival horror games in regards to quality and innovation, Dead Space and Dead Space 2 are criminally overlooked. And while we can make other videos talking about the atmosphere, the weapons, and all that kind of stuff, I wanted to take some time to just be a lot of the control schemes we take for granted when we play games nowadays, we owe a lot of how good games feel to Dead Space 2. In fact, I'd honestly go as far as to say that Dead Space 2 is the Halo 1 of third-person shooters in regards to setting a standard and trends for controls and UI. Anyways, sorry I haven't been posting as often. I've been having a very active social life, which I'm honestly happy about because I haven't really done that in the past 5-10 years. So I'm still making videos, but don't be too worried if I take breaks in between. Anyways, this has been Bliskin, over and out.
This is Solid Snake. Hey, subscribe to Pliskin Boy. God damn it.
You heard him.